Well, hi, everyone. Before we get started, I really just want to take an opportunity to really thank the folks at the Filson for inviting me to be here. I'm so happy to be here with you tonight talking about someone that I love very much, Harlan Hubbard. And I'm also so happy that so many of you wanted to come out and see this great exhibit and that you wanted to really join this conversation to talk about why shanty-boats are important to our understanding of the 19th and 20th century in America. We still have so much to learn about this way of life and the people who lived it, but I really think the Filson did a great job with this exhibit in opening that door of discovery for us. And in addition, as they've mentioned and as they've been marketing, this is only the first in a series of really great programs they have planned around this exhibit, and so I hope you'll come back and participate in each one. I also want to make a quick note about some of the text and about the images that I'll be using in my slides tonight. Some of the images in my PowerPoint are from the Kentucky Historical Society, University of Louisville, from the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Courier-Journal, and I have one image from Angie Reed Garner, who is a contemporary artist who is having a wonderful painting opening tomorrow evening. All of these I'm using with thanks, and they're purely for educational and documentary purposes. And also, in the interest of space and time, I'm not giving full citations for my text quotations so that we can fit as much of Hubbard's writing into this talk as possible. So if you have questions about any of the quotes that I use, about any of my sources, or just in general questions that we can't address in the question and answer period later on, I'm here for them, and I'm more than happy to try and answer your question. So for now, why don't we go ahead and jump right into the reason many of us even know what a shanty-boat is, Harlan Hubbard. And for over a decade, I've drifted past the sights and the stories of the Ohio River Valley with Harlan sort of sitting with me as my astute philosophical companion. And though I'm not originally from Louisville, I still grew up on a city along the Ohio River. I grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia, if you know it. Even though I'm not from this area, I still felt an instant connection with Harlan's story, especially when I learned that some of his early years were spent hitchhiking up to Pittsburgh, which is about an hour away from where I grew up, and then canoeing the entire way back down from Pittsburgh to his hometown in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, outside of Cincinnati. And so, though thankfully not in a canoe, I also came downriver from Pittsburgh and found myself making a home here in Kentuckiana. And ever since, it's been my joy to present my research on Harlan to the public in different kinds of forums and formats. But in the past, most of my research has been strictly from the perspective of an art historian. And over the course of my immersion into Hubbard's life, I was fortunate to get to know many people who actually knew Harlan. I never had the fortune to meet him. He died before I was born. But I've been fortunate to know many people who did get to know him. And really, no two of his acquaintances articulate his or her experience of his life or work in quite the same way. Some people love Harlan most for his art, which is how I came to study him. Some people love Harlan most for his writing, which is what he's probably best known for. And some people love Harlan because of his life, which ultimately is the foundation for both the art and the writing. Okay, I will do that. There we go. And even the great Kentucky writer Wendell Berry, in his 1990 biography of Harlan, writes of Harlan's unassuming quiet mastery of many different kinds of things. He says, "The most desirable result of reading Harlan's writings, looking at his pictures, and thinking long about him, is not an idea or a set of ideas, but his return to our minds more vividly than ever as a presence, so that we think of him working in his days of many tasks, or rowing his John boat on the river, or walking along the slope with a young man's stride, though he is old. we will think of him as immensely capable and accomplished, more so than he allowed us to discover while he lived. And so, as Barry makes evident, the extremely prolific and accomplished Hubbard gives us a lot of ground to cover. So, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too long formally introducing the Hubbards, as I suspect many of us are coming into this room with at least a working knowledge of them. But for those of you who don't already have a working knowledge, let me take a few minutes to introduce you to a few of the Harlans. And first, from just the little I've said about Harlan, you will have noted that Harlan was a very accomplished writer. During his lifetime, he published 2 volumes, Shanty-boat in 1953, of which there was a beautiful first edition in the exhibit you just saw, and Payne Hollow in 1974, which afforded him modest success as an author. And after his death, further editions with added content and annotations were published, in addition to a book of his early journals. However, Harlan was a meticulous journaler and note-taker and annotator, and there is still a vast amount of his writing that remains unpublished. My upcoming book will include some of this, but there's plenty left for any intrepid researchers out there in the crowd who want to write a book about Harlan too. Likewise, Harlan was also immensely prolific in his artistic endeavors. He considered himself an artist first and was classically trained at both the National Academy of Design in New York and at the Art Academy of Cincinnati, even though he didn't end up finishing either program and chose to come back to his home. His relative lack of success in the art world distressed Harlan somewhat in his youth, but it never discouraged him from churning out incredible amounts of material throughout his life. And although he was known to have discarded or destroyed a percentage of his paintings and sketches on several occasions, he would eventually leave behind, when he died, hundreds of works in oil, thousands of watercolors, and a great number of woodcuts, sketches, drawings, and maps. But both his talent as an artist and his skill as a writer were ultimately due to his greatest muse, which was nature. And he had a great inclination toward naturalism. In the last few months and during the course of my research for the upcoming book and for this talk, I've enjoyed stepping into the shoes of even further iterations of Harlan's that spring up like weeds as I read about him. Harlan the explorer, Harlan the environmentalist, Harlan the bird watcher, Harlan the cartographer. He really did it all. Especially in his hundreds of pages of sketchbooks and journals, both published and unpublished, Harlan recorded the details of the Ohio River Valley lovingly and with great specificity, like a true naturalist. And his specificity extended to things other than just his beloved trees and his hollers. His love for the land and the river brought him into the company of other people who loved the land and the river. And his accounts of the landscapes around him are inseparable from the tales he tells of the people who inhabit and care for those landscapes. And especially during his time spent along and eventually on the river, Harlan resurrects the characters and the concerns of the true river folk of the Ohio, and through them he catalogs their wisdom and their memory. And this is where we begin to see the Harlans who are of special concern for us this evening. Harlan the documentarian, Harlan the culturalist, and especially Harlan the elegist. The title of tonight's lecture, Recording a Vanishing World, probably clues you in as to why I'm using such a dramatic word as elegist. Elegizing, or the act of mourning a loss, often through artistic expression, is, to me, absolutely a major achievement in Harlan's legacy. Harlan was a great admirer and reader of classical literature and poetry, and at times, his writing can sound like something lifted out of Ovid or out of Virgil. And throughout his career, Hubbard expressed his feelings of loss for a various number of subjects, not with admonitions, but with pure sorrow and worry for the future. And with almost effortless eloquence of form and of language, these pieces of his work stand as a counterpoint to the hubris of a world that in many ways, is blind to the loss of its landscape and to the people who live in it. And with all themes in Harlan's work, the fate of people is inexorably tied to the fate of place. So for this reason, I've felt it important to approach Harlan as an anthropologist might, with an interdisciplinary eye, and not just the eye of an art historian, in order to see the different kinds of elegies that Hubbard presents to us through his legacy. And I've chosen to focus on 3 of them tonight. Harlan's elegy for the loss of place, Harlan's elegy for the loss of people, and Harlan's elegy for the loss of principle. And they'll outline our discussion and give us an overview of what Harlan has to share with us about these vanishing shanty-boat culture, and help us compare and contrast Hubbard's experience with those of the people that he met and admired. So in the first section, we'll try to understand some of the environmental conditions of the Ohio River Valley that really contributed to shanty-boating's decline. And we'll cite some of Harlan's descriptions of how weather and natural disasters were particularly devastating to people living on or near the river. Next, we'll cover some of the socioeconomic realities of shanty-boat culture that really made its existence tenuous at best from the beginning, and through those realities, we'll reveal the essential differences in Harlan's approach to shanty-boat life to that of most shanty-boaters. And finally, we'll explore what Harlan saw as the philosophical poverty that was inherent in the loss of shanty-boat culture on the Ohio River, and how its loss eventually became the catalyst that would underpin the creation of his and Anna's life together at Payne Hollow. But in order to talk about these issues, why don't we go ahead and discuss how Harlan became interested in shanty-boat culture to begin with. And from the very early journals and sketchbooks, it's evident that while traveling around, documenting and sketching and observing his surroundings, Harlan was already planting the seeds for his future of love for this class of people. And in his book Shanty-boat, he acknowledges this habit of listening and cultivating from rivermen their stories and trying to preserve these stories for posterity. And he writes, "It is to be regretted that the race of shantyboaters is dying out. Today, you're likely to find even an active fisherman living in a house, on land, or in a trailer. Those who still live on the water have motorboats to shove their fleet upstream and down, too, so that the art of drifting is forgotten. The younger generation seem to have interests away from the river. They will never be able to tell the tales their granddads can. I cultivated the acquaintance of old-time river people whenever possible, and I listened to their yarns almost with reverence. The simplicity and naturalness of their way of living fascinated me and gave a definite shape to the vague longing which the flowing river had inspired." Now, his cultivation, revealing an aptitude or interest as a naturalist or as a culturalist, most likely came from his childhood spent exploring this area with his 2 brothers. And although they would eventually leave home to pursue careers early in their lives, his brother Lucian Hubbard, for example, would go on to become a Hollywood producer on the first film to win an Academy Award, 1927's Wings. Harlan spent lots of time with them, however, as a boy, and they would go on long camping and canoeing trips on the river. And then his fascination further blossomed after reading Thoreau's Walden for the first time while working on a farm in upstate New York. And many of you have probably heard Harlan referred to as Kentucky's Thoreau. His voracious curiosity and immense appetite for adventure pushed him to take Thoreau's principles to heart, and after meeting and marrying the love of his life, Anna Eichenhout, in 1943, Harlan would live into the principles more fully than Thoreau himself ever could. But even before fully absorbing Thoreau, Harlan spoke highly of another writer when asked about his influences, a man named Reuben Gold Thwaites. Thwaites was an avid historian, authoring multiple books and essays with subjects that would have been near and dear to Harlan's heart, such as the Lewis and Clark expedition, the 1673 journey of Marquette and Joliet on the Mississippi River, the 1749 account of Celeron journeying down the Ohio, which Harlan writes about in his journals, and most importantly, the turn-of-the-century account of Thwaites' own journey down the Ohio with his wife in a rowboat. And this account, when read as a companion piece to Harlan's writing, feels uncannily familiar, but also serves as an excellent record against which to mark the differences in Ohio river culture Hubbard describes years later. And this is Thwaites. For example, when Thwaites describes Louisville's Towhead Island, which all of you, now that you have seen this wonderful exhibit here at the Filson, will know was an island just offshore of the Point neighborhood by where the Big Four Bridge is, and was the largest settlement of shantyboaters in Louisville and one of the largest on the Ohio. Thwaites described Louisville's Towhead Island in this way, as having almost a solid flank of houseboats running along it. 50 years later, Hubbard writes, "Towhead Island, there was an old wreck of a barge nearby, out of which I got a few drift bolts. A small, tattered shanty-boat lay behind the island. When its solitary inhabitant saw me, a stranger, he called, 'What you got to swap?' What a difference 50 years makes." But although a lot of the big shantyboat settlements, like Louisville's Towhead Island, were on the decline, Harlan's original home turf of Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which, as I mentioned, was a suburb of Cincinnati, was nearby something of an anomaly, a thriving shantyboat settlement at a place called Brent. And Harlan came to know Brent, also called Willison's Landing, very well because he had a painting studio in old Mr. Willison's lumber mill from 1929 until 1931. And during his time in Brent, he began to closely observe the residents who lived there along the river. And this was his first true exposure to shantyboat culture. And he writes in his journal, "Brent had always been a haven for shantyboaters, and a sizable remnant of the colony remained. Most of the small boats were beached out on a steep bank at different levels. A large houseboat lay away downstream where the bank was less steep. It was there, and the same family lived on it, 20 years later when I was building my own shantyboat nearby. I became acquainted with all the shantyboat people as much as possible, for I never did penetrate the mystery of some of those solitary men. The inhabitants of Brent were a homogeneous lot, inclined toward shantyboating, though they might live in a house and have a steady job. They recognized shantyboat tendencies in me, and to the city people who came down to look at the river, I was just another Brent character." Though Harlan felt a sense of camaraderie with some of these shantyboaters at Brent, many of whom he brings to life in his writings, and I encourage all of you, if you're interested in the things we're talking about tonight, and if you haven't already read his wonderful books, to pick those up and to really dive in for yourself. Even though he brings many of these folks to life in his writing, at that time he harbored his dreams of living like them in secret, continuing to live with one foot pretty solidly planted in the real world. And his early journals prior to meeting Anna in 1943 swing from the elation of the dreams he hopes for and the distress of his current reality. And in his journals, he wrote, "Sometimes I long to write a river book, a book of the Ohio, which shall itself flow through the pages, and the very smells and sounds shall be there too. But as for writing a book, I lack so much. I am not wise or experienced, even on the river. I could not pretend to write a book about steamboats, as I have not the knowledge, and that can never be gotten entirely from research among books or even living men. With the shantyboaters and other inhabitants of the river shores, some as native as willow and horseweed, I feel like an outsider, like an occasional visitor there from the town on the hill, which is true enough. Perhaps when I give my life completely to the river, I will be able to write then a true river book. So, thank goodness for Anna coming along. And while his life up to meeting Anna had been spent straddling this wild life he wanted and the more sober life that he had, Anna's devoted support to his dream to simplify, as Thoreau says, finally pushed him to pursue his dream in earnest. And in his journal entry from September 27th, 1944, just about a year after meeting Anna and marrying her, he writes, "I've taken the first step in a project long dreamed of, the building of a houseboat on the river. I'm not sure whether houseboat or shanty-boat is the better term, but when built, I suppose there will be no doubt as to which is more suitable. So far, I've located some fine timbers for the gunwales and possibly for the planking, but I'll not describe it until it's at hand to work with. Lumber is difficult to find now, good or bad, and expensive. Other conditions would seem to make it a time not propitious for the enterprise, but we know that it is right for us. I've gathered a quantity of information, instructions, and advice, all of which I must sort over like a pile of old lumber, using what seems best and most suitable to me." And here are some images of the shanty-boat that they would eventually build and take on a remarkable 1,385-mile odyssey from Brent, Kentucky to New Orleans, Louisiana, between November 1944 and April 1950. And all of this is chronicled in his most famous publication, Shanty-boat, which you see here in the center. And through it all, Anna's constancy and creativity really shines clearly as a beacon for Harlan. He writes of her, "She was tall and slender, fair-haired. I marveled that she could keep her clothes so neat and clean. Even her camp slacks were smart and trim. Then I thought momentarily that the approaching months of shanty-boating and riverbank might be a trying ordeal to someone so constituted, but I was confident that she would evolve a pattern of living which, while still giving scope to my wild longings, would satisfy her innate delicacy, her femininity, and self-respect. She would make something of our shanty-boat life that her family and friends would respect and admire and enjoy, even though some of them might look askance in the beginning." And this is a good place to dive into our first Hubbard elegy, his elegy for the loss of place. So, one constant in the life of a shanty-boater, whether in 1844 or in 1944, was the awesome, overwhelming power of the weather and the seasons. And this awesome image that you're looking at right now from the Courier-Journal shows a houseboat near a bridge in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, completely at the mercy of the Ohio. The river, as you can see, is still choked with melting ice, and this picture was taken just before the devastating flood of 1937 that was soon to follow. Those of us who are familiar with rivers in general will be familiar with their moods. Some of us possibly remember a time that the Ohio or one of its tributaries froze solidly in winter, just as we probably remember the terrifying sounds of a river in a period of thaw with cracking ice. And remembering a thaw surely means remembering those floods that follow in spring, bringing with them both rebirth and destruction. And the storms of summer, the winds of fall, we can really imagine the churning, seizing water of the Ohio giving way to clear, placid vistas of calm. We imagine these scenes of the river from the banks at a safe distance, but not Harlan. And Harlan indicts us a little bit and says, in modern living, there is such protection from the elements that those who live in cities pay little regard to the weather unless some extreme condition causes them discomfort or inconvenience. On the river, we had lost this sense of communal protection, and we were on our own. Our existence tended toward the primitive. Since natural forces affected us directly, we became more alert and watchful, always scanning the face of the sky, noting all changes of the wind, weather, and the river. We were wary and apprehensive, especially in those beginning days, as if threatened by some unseen, imminent danger. And then later in the entry, he writes, "Perhaps all this vigilance and care are part of the price a shantyboater pays for his independence. After all, the dangers which beset him are but shadows compared to those confronting the dwellers in cities." Now, I don't know how we all feel about that statement, whether we feel that shantyboating life is easier than living in a city, but I will say that no amount of vigilance and care could protect vulnerable shantyboat communities from natural disasters on a grand scale. And while the regular cycles of weather and seasons on the river could be difficult and sometimes deadly, nothing really could compare to the type of absolute devastation, something like the 1937 or the 1945 floods that followed. And the map on the screen, and I'm sorry I don't have a higher resolution for you, but the map on the screen shows you in blue just how far into the city of Louisville the floodwaters reached in 1937. And poor communities, riverside communities like Portland and the Point, barely recovered from the disaster, if at all. The wealthier inhabitants of Louisville began to move eastward out of the floodplain into what would become modern St. Matthews, Linden, and Prospect area neighborhoods. But the communities left in the floodplain, most of downtown and the West End, still face the socioeconomic challenges inherited from this great exodus after the 1937 flood. Although we're finally starting to see the community's efforts to try and revitalize some of these areas. Now, although Hubbard wasn't yet living on the river at the time of the 1937 flood, he still made observations on its destruction in his journals. And in his journal from February 9th, 1937, he writes, "I work at the driftwood in the yard, piling up the logs, tossing the kindling to one side and raking the fine drift into piles. Into my bare front yard, the last place one would expect to find firewood, the river brought enough for me to keep warm all winter. In almost every way, this flood was kindly meant, and wise people would be glad to have their dirty, worn houses and furniture drift away and build new ones out of the reach of another flood, abandoning the land to cornfields. Then, what a beautiful river! Surely there is enough labor and material to replace everything the river touched. I speak of such plans knowing that no radical change will ever take place in the course of the majority of people, and I should be greatly alarmed to see simple natural designs carried out on a large scale. There will always be, like the poor, a great mass, dependably orthodox and unreasoning." And this is a keen observation, that society will always have the poor, and along with them will always have some configuration of people in power who ignore the need to find creative solutions to support the poor. And the shantyboat communities, like the one at Towhead Island, would never recover from the destruction of the 1937 flood. And this is why, in 1948, when Harlan and Anna drifted through Louisville on their shantyboat, they didn't see Thwaites' flank of houseboats that he had marveled at the turn of the century. The inhabitants of the community at the Point had lost what little they had and could never return. Which brings us to our second Hubbard elegy, the elegy for the loss of people. As I mentioned before, Harlan's notion of landscape and place is tied up with the people who live there. But what happens when those people and their cultural memories have literally washed away downstream? Harlan's response was to pick up the pieces and finally write his river book. And Harlan's Shanty-boat, his long-dreamed-of river book, takes a lot of cues from Thwaites' turn-of-the-century account. And both accounts discuss, in some amount the socio-economic condition of the shanty-boat cultures that they knew, though perhaps less frankly than they might have. Both Harlan and Thwaites differed from the residents of those communities because no matter how invested in their subjects they were, in one essential way, they were very different. Harlan and Thwaites were living on the river by choice, not by necessity. And this distinction of choice versus necessity is important to remember when reading a Hubbard account or a Thwaites account. Although both men gave us wonderful records, their writing, written from a position of relative privilege, can occasionally feel a little romanticized or idealized. This is neither good nor bad, but it bears mentioning, especially in light of other popular accounts of shanty-boat culture, like this one from the Courier-Journal on October 8th, 1899, that feels highly idealized and maybe even a little patronizing. So as you can see, the writer of this feature on shanty-boat life, though he gave us a fascinating article for posterity, has produced something that approaches caricature, keeping in mind that most of the families and individuals living in this poor people's park, the title the paper gives to the shanty-boat community at Towhead Island, keeping in mind that most of them were there because they literally couldn't afford to live on land. The captions to the photos reading, "Shanty-boat folk as happy as others," and "happy home under the bridge," and "clean and cozy," can be a little jarring. At the level of disconnection that it shows between the shanty-boaters living these lives and the average subscriber of the Courier-Journal is palpable. Now, Thwaites has a passage in Afloat, his book of floating down the Ohio River in a rowboat. Thwaites has a passage that covers the typical kind of folks that he found in shanty-boat communities. Most of them he describes as disadvantaged, poor, and underprivileged in some way, but almost always his descriptions somewhat confirm some kind of upper middle class stereotype that would deem them decidedly not clean and cozy to the Courier-Journal's distribution list. But he writes, "Among the houseboat folk are young working couples starting out in life and hoping ultimately to gain foothold on land, unfortunate people who are making a fresh start, men regularly employed in riverside factories and mills, invalids who at small expense are trying the fresh air cure, others who drift up and down the Ohio seeking casual work, and legitimate fishermen who find it convenient to be near their nets and to move about according to the needs of their calling. But a goodly proportion of these boats are inhabited by the lowest class of the population, poor crackers who have managed to scrape together enough money to buy or enough energy and driftwood to build such a craft. And near or at the towns, many are occupied by gamblers, illicit liquor dealers, and others who, while plying nefarious trades, make a pretense of following the occupation of the apostles." But even despite the somewhat self-righteous and judgmental accounts of the class as a whole, within the text of the Poor People's Park feature, that ironically stars a metafictional character called the Vagrant, there's still some lucidity of fact. And in that feature, we hear, "But it was the water nomads that the Vagrant came to visit. He had often thought about them in a casual way. He had read somewhere that before 1896, the people living in houseboats along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers were estimated as being 10,000 in number. There are not nearly so many now, for a vigorous war has been waged against them as a class since then, Cincinnati and Louisville passing strong ordinances against them, and the river towns following their example. Many people have abandoned the life on account of the odium attached, until today it is only those who are virtually wedded to the life that survives." So these shanty-boaters that hang on, who are virtually wedded to the life, would generally have been those who could afford to do so, having a steady income that provided means to cover the increasingly steep taxes levied on their floating homes. And the ordinances the article's author refers to were really only the first in a series of legislations created to close the loophole shantyboaters had found and sometimes exploited related to taxes and official jurisdiction under the law. Thwaites, with a little less poetry maybe than Harlan, addresses the tax issue directly in his book. He says, "Houseboat people, whether beached or afloat, pay no rent, and heretofore have paid no taxes. Kentucky has recently passed, more as a police regulation than as a means of revenue, an act levying a state tax of $25 upon each craft of this character. And the other commonwealths abutting upon the river are considering the policy of doing likewise. The houseboatmen have, however, recently formed a protective association and proposed to fight the new laws on constitutional grounds, the contention being that the Ohio is a national highway and that commerce upon it cannot be hampered by state taxes. This view does not, however, affect the taxability of beached boats, which are clearly squatters on state soil." And later he writes, "Having neither rent nor taxes to pay, and for the most part not voting, and having no share in the political or social life of landmen, they are in the state, not of it, a class unto themselves whose condition is well worthy the study of economists." Now, Thwaites was certainly right, because here we all are, still talking about them. And beyond just the study of economists, the phenomenon of shantyboat culture continues to be of great interest to many of us from many different backgrounds. The larger group programming body afloat an Ohio River way of life, of which the Filson exhibit is a part and this talk is a part, is proof that there's still a lot to say about these folks who had so much to teach Hubbard and can still have something to teach us about ourselves. And another afloat exhibit that opened this month, that's actually having its official opening tomorrow evening, is Angie Reed Garner's cycle of paintings at the Garner Narrative Gallery called Shanty-boating. And Angie uses the image of the shantyboat as an icon representing all kinds of oppression, subjugation, and injustice. About the painting you see here, called Creek Did Rise, Angie says, "While researching shantyboats, I came across a photo of an old one, lodged improbably among some trees, gracefully rotting, no water in sight. We aren't in charge of our stories. We just live them as best we can." Angie's series, and indeed many of her larger themes and ideas as an artist in general, was inspired by Harlan Hubbard's choice to look at the world through the eyes of a class that was largely without choice. And perhaps that's why, despite his tendency to romanticize sometimes about shantyboat culture, we're still so affected by his beautiful works. By choosing the life of an outsider, Harlan was able to memorialize with philosophical dignity what many shantyboaters were able to bring to their lives and to their social status, even when that status was completely out of their control. They weren't always in charge of their stories, but Harlan shows them living it the best that they can. Which brings us to our final Hubbard elegy, the elegy for loss of principle. One irreplaceable boon in Harlan's career is the clarity of purpose and philosophy one can identify in all aspects of his work. And Harlan and Anna, while living the life of a shantyboater, never lost their sense of beauty inherent in the life that they had chosen. At the beginning of Shanty-boat, he writes, "The true shantyboater has a purer love for the river than had his drifting flatboat predecessors. These were concerned with trade or new land. To him, the river is more than a means of livelihood. It is a way of life, the only one he knows which answers his innate longing to be untrammeled and independent, to live on the fringe of society, almost beyond the law, beyond taxes, and beyond ownership of property. His drifting downstream is as natural to him as is his growing old in the stream of time. Away from the river, he languishes, as if taken from his natural element. For Harlan, the shanty-boater becomes mythical, a creation like the Western cowboy or like the early explorers of Lewis and Clark, who take on this totemic hero status for clinging so fiercely to the American ideals of liberty and independence. And in his 1939 journal entry, where he first mentions his desire to write his true river book, Harlan says, "Nothing costs more than independence, both in mind and substance. It is a dangerous course, almost certain to end in destruction if carried to extreme limits. It means daily, continued warfare, single-handed against the world. This earth, of itself nothing, is a field of action." Harlan and Anna committed to honor a way of life that to them represented the purest iteration of the American dream. And finally completing their long trek down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in April of 1950, Harlan and Anna looked to what was next for them. Harlan closes out Shanty-boat in New Orleans with a poetic allusion that beautifully articulates their future. As we were being lowered to sea level and the gates behind us loomed higher, we regretted for a moment our abrupt and unceremonious departure from the river. How much more fitting to be carried out to the salt water, like the river's driftwood. Yet the driftwood left the river never to return. It would at last sink into the sea or be stranded on some far beach. Like the driftwood or boat, would leave its bones in that marshy land. We ourselves would be more like the river's water, which, though it leave the river and mingles with the ocean, is at last, by devious course, brought back again to its starting place. And to me, this reads like another smaller elegy for a part of their life, now complete, their shanty-boat portion of their life, and a new part ready to begin, their life at Payne Hollow. And indeed, returning to a spot near Madison, Indiana, suggested to them by another shanty-boater who loved stopping at this spot, Payne Hollow, Harlan and Anna Hubbard began their life back on land, but never losing that ethos of independence that they so admired in the shanty-boaters. And I'll end tonight's lecture with the final words of his book, Payne Hollow, his second and last book during his lifetime. And I hope that these words really inspire us to find our inner shanty-boater and, as Harlan would desire from all of us, to meet each other on the field of action, to find beauty in the downtrodden, creativity in the simple, and to find strength in the face of destruction. Today, as I swam in the river, I looked up with a wild duck's eye into the trees, waving as the wind rushed through them, lightly rattling the cottonwood trees, tossing back the maple branches to reveal their silvery undersides. Above the trees, ragged white clouds sailed across the void of sky. Suddenly, I felt alone on earth, as I do when lying on the damp ground in spring to see closely the bloodroot raising its leaf sheath through the mold. These moments are not rare. I can summon them when I feel the need to retire into the wilderness. For this is my wilderness, untouched by man or infinite grace and harmony. Even winter, though its cold may snap the thread of my existence, is part of the gentle, soft-edged creation which is wild nature, ever cheery and friendly, a solace to the spirit of man. We live on a frontier, and a clear vision can see the wilderness extending into the unknown distance. To keep this view before us is not easy. Civilization becomes more clamorous and insistent. It is in a way to dominate the earth. Nature seems already to have lost some of its vitality and health. The river is polluted, the very stars are tampered with. Even in Payne Hollow, the situation seems almost hopeless on a Sunday afternoon in summer when the outboards go skidding across the surface of the river and the hellish sounds come from all quarters. I turn within, let the day pass. Then, early Monday morning, when I go down to the shore, the quiet river seems newly created. Mist lifts off the smooth water, creeps up into Payne Hollow, and rises skyward until it catches the light of the morning sun. My faith is renewed, and I rejoice after my own fashion. Thank you all very much. So it would be my pleasure now to take any questions that you might have or to hear any comments that you might have. I welcome both. I believe we have a cordless mic somewhere that, should you wish to... Pardon? Oh, fine. Okay. We do not have a cordless mic, so you can yell it out to me and I will repeat it. Yes, sir.
How did he make a living?
Okay. How did he make a living? So, Hubbard tried as best he could to find what he needed in the environment that surrounded him. But of course, that is not possible for some things. And there's a wonderful quote that he has that I love very much where he talks about dentists and how dentists are an essential thing that you can't find in nature. And you cannot find someone to pull your tooth for you in a way that maybe would make you happy and feel comfortable. So there were some essential things that he did have to purchase. So even though they grew most of their own food, they did do lots of fishing. They even, on their shanty-boat, on that nice little platform off the back, have a beehive that they kept on their shanty-boat to have honey. He did need some stream of money coming in. Some of that came from selling artwork. He did not have an intensely boffo career because he didn't throw himself into the art world. He didn't care to throw himself into the art world the same way many people need to market themselves, to make themselves effective as artists. But he did have a loyal group of collectors and of friends who would purchase from him. And because he was traveling and doing all of this wonderful painting and documenting of his travels down the river, many of the people who lived along the river were very interested in purchasing some of his pieces. He didn't jack up the prices really high or anything like that. They were very affordable. So some of it did come from art and from a few commissions that he did. But the majority of it was really trying to live simply as best he could. And it seems somewhat unthinkable to me to think of not having a steady job or something, that you are receiving a pension or something. But he managed with an intensely a wonderful commitment to this kind of life to really find what he needed. And one of the phrases that is associated with Hubbard is, "What we need is at hand." And he really lived into that phrase. Yes?
What kind of a background did Anna have?
Sure. That's a great question. So this young woman asked what kind of background did Anna come from that she was comfortable signing on to this kind of life. And that's a question I asked myself when I first encountered the story of Harlan, too. Anna was from Michigan, and she did have a family that occasionally camped and did some things, but it was nothing particularly out of the ordinary. She was not an outdoors woman living on the frontier, doing something that was anything like what Harlan was trying to do when he was younger, doing these great canoe trips down the Ohio. She actually went to school and became a librarian, and she was working as a librarian in Cincinnati and that's how she met Harlan. And it's important to note that even though they both sound a little rough and tumble, it's important to note that they were both intensely cultured and educated folks who had a great number of interests in the fine arts. So both of them were accomplished musicians. Anna a little more so than Harlan, but both of them were musicians, and they actually brought their instruments on the Shanty-boat with them. So there was a cello and a violin in residence with them on the Shanty-boat as well. Keep the important things, you guys. So in any case, they had a lot of interests that were similar. They both loved music. They both loved literature. They were voracious readers, and they both loved art. And so they met and connected on these passions that they shared in the fine arts. And then, as sometimes happens with love, we change our course of life to suit the person we love. And Anna was devoted to Harlan as Harlan was devoted to Anna. And they, I think, recognized together as a couple that Harlan's vision for the future and that his goals were something that were important enough to him that she wanted to support them no matter what. And if you have read or ever choose to read the whole of Shanty-boat and Pain Hollow, you will hear just how inventive Anna was and how invested she became in the life. And it's not like this was something where she gave up some grand dream. She wanted to be with Harlan, and she wanted to be living this wonderful life with this wonderful, talented man, having an adventure, and they sure did. Yes?
Have you visited Pain Hollow? Is it a wreck?
No, it's not a wreck. It's being taken care of by the person that it was willed to at Harlan's death. So there is a caretaker, and he knew Harlan very well. I have not yet been to Pain Hollow, but I have seen lots of footage, and I have built a correspondence with the person who runs Pain Hollow now. It's a difficult place to get to. It's not on any road, and you either have to get to it by the river or you have to hike a mile into the woods to get to it, which is worth it, but a challenging thing to sometimes be able to do for anyone. So, but it is, as far as I am assured by the people that I've known who have visited and by the person who in whose hands it is, it's being taken care of. Yeah. Yes?
Mark Twain also had a lot of writings about life on the Mississippi and so forth, and I wonder if Harlan had made some reference in his writings to the effect that he had read Mark Twain.
That's a great a great observation and question. Mark Twain also spent a lot of time writing about life on the Mississippi River, and of course, Harlan was not just on the Ohio; he was on the Mississippi as well. And I did mention Harlan was a voracious reader, and in fact, he and Anna made long lists of the books that they read while they were on their shanty-boat. And Mark Twain is among the titles listed in those lists. He doesn't talk extensively about a lot of people, which is part of why him mentioning Thwaites multiple times and mentioning a couple of these other explorers multiple times, like Celeron, mentioning those accounts is why I talked about them as much as I did, but he integrated huge amounts of literature into his and Anna's life, and these lists are extensive, several pages long, of the books that they read just on their journey from 1944 to 1950. But yes, Mark Twain was among those, and it would be interesting to dig through some of his unpublished journals to see if he writes anything specific about Twain. Thank you. Yes?
I saw in the exhibit the 1900 census.
Yes.
How frequently did it catch people on the census?
That's something I don't know a ton about, but I can tell you that there's a wonderful anecdote that Hubbard tells about a census taker, and I don't know if any of you have seen the wonderful Morgan Atkinson documentary Wonder that came out about Hubbard's life and is going to be shown here in a couple months at the Filson. But in that, it illustrates a really wonderful story of Harlan being found by a census taker who attempted to clamber out of a rowboat and onto his shanty-boat and to try and take census information from him. And Harlan was not forthcoming with information, nor did he have a lot of information that was particularly useful to the census taker either. So while I can't speak at great length to everyone's experience, I know that Harlan certainly thought it was pretty funny when census takers would come and try to get information from him because, yeah, that was not something that the census takers really knew what to do with. Yes, sir.
The drifters would end up in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
Did they remain there, a lot of them? What happened to the boats, or did they travel back? Was it a round journey for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this gentleman was asking when drifters would make it to the bayou in Louisiana and in New Orleans, what would happen? Would they stay there? Would they sell their boats? Would they, as Harlan mentioned, would they continue on into the ocean? What would they do? At least for Harlan and Anna, they sold their boat, bought a car, and took a 2-year journey out west to visit his brother in California, but also to document their trip out west, and there are lots of beautiful watercolors and journals from that trip. But speaking for the larger shanty-boat population, I do know that's not an area that I've done a lot of research on, but I will tell you that in another series of journals that were published posthumously after Hubbard's death, called Shanty-boat on the Bayous, there's a lot of accounts of his time in the bayous, and they lingered for a long time in the bayous, getting to know lots of different communities that had sprung up in these little areas down there and in the marshland. And they spent, I can't remember exactly how long it was, but they spent at least a few months and got to know lots of people who lived regularly down there and had chosen to relocate. So at least from Hubbard's account, some people did choose to stay. I suspect most were not, like Harlan and Anna, on a cruise, not a cruise, but we're not doing this great philosophical experiment where they could then sell their boat afterward and move on. Most people, right? Yes. Adventure was the name of the game. And adventure for most shanty boaters, as we were discussing, was not really the name of the game. Survival was the name of the game for most. Okay, one more? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about Anna, and I wonder, did she collaborate in any of the books? Did she keep a journal? What was her legacy?
Sure. Well, I can tell you that she, at least from my perspective, trying to read some of the primary source material from Harlan, his writing was a little bit challenging sometimes. So one thing that she did was she was his transcriber and typist for a lot of his work. And she could read his stuff because she loved the man and she had lived with him on a shanty boat. But in any case, a huge contribution was helping him edit, compile, and type out his manuscripts. But just in general, and I think in that quote that showed Anna there next to the Shanty-boat, where he was talking about her constitution and making the life on the Shanty-boat something they could all be proud of. And not to sound regressive in any way, but she was happy building a beautiful, comfortable life for them out of the circumstances that they had. And so she had contributions of making these wonderful lists of books that they would bring, of playing her cello for him while he painted, of learning how to make these very strange dishes out of all of these strange gophers and squirrels and things that they would forage. She did a lot of work in that could be called just as creative as what Harlan was doing, especially in terms of gopher. I can't even imagine. But in terms of a more professional legacy, it's definitely helping Harlan with his publications. Sure. Okay. Well, thank you all so much.